Hello, everybody. Welcome back to teissTalk. After the summer, you will recognize that I am not Jenny Radcliffe. Jenny has got some connection problems at the moment. I can see she's trying to get back in the room. As soon as she does, I will go off stage and I will bring Jenny back onto stage. If you have any questions today for our opening guest or our panelists, could you please use the Q&A tab? As soon as Jenny comes back and joins us, she will be awarding a teissTalk mug to the best question or the best comment. Whilst I'm still trying to get Jenny back on stage, I'd like to invite our opening guest up. And today's opening guest is Adam Cassell, the head of cybersecurity at British Transport Police. Adam, can I ask you to turn on your camera and mic and join me on stage?
Yep. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Adam. How are you?
Oh, very well, thank you. Enjoying the Cambridge sunshine here. It's about 30 degrees, so just getting that last bit of summer, hopefully.
Brilliant. I know that Jenny was going to talk to you a little bit about your career. So obviously I'm not Jenny. I'm not going to ask the sort of leading questions that she was going to ask, but could you give us just sort of a quick overview of where you've worked and what you've done?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of came into, I guess, security via a sort of parallel route through sort of, change and transformation. I did spend some kind of years sort of writing firewall policy and kind of doing networking stuff. But I spent a lot of time in sort of project and program management. And from there, sort of, I spent a lot of time doing kind of offshoring and setting up sort of collaborative infrastructure. And then going out and doing sort of ISO 27001 audits and things like that on our sort of vendors overseas. And I guess that sort of led me sort of more and more into a kind of a security kind of, pure play, if you like, just doing specific kind of security roles. And I've been fortunate to work across quite a few different kind of industries. I spent about 5 years in utilities, several years in pharmaceuticals, quite a bit of time in financial services, and it's quite interesting how those different sectors do security, because they all do it a bit differently. And as you might imagine, financial services is quite mature compared to some of those others that maybe aren't so. And I guess I went from sort of program and project management, program directorships, into kind of doing sort of more heads of security and CISO roles, and that sort of led me to my current position with the British Transport Police.
Excellent. I think I remember when I contacted you, it was you were doing your previous role, so it was at Sainsbury's, or at least you were interim there. Is there much of a difference as you've moved from Sainsbury's and retail and obviously finance into British Transport Police?
Yeah, I mean, there's a massive difference in maturity. I mean, without sort of giving too much away, you have a maturity of process with a bank because you are a regulated entity, so you've always got the FCA kind of breathing down your neck. So you have to do things right. Whereas, where I am currently, it's a little bit more of a kind of free for all and make it up as you go along. I think when I joined Sainsbury's, it was a bit of a baptism of fire. I mean, I was supposed to be, say, interim, so just keep the lights on for 3 months while the sort of main incumbent was waiting to sort of arrive. And on day one, I walked into sort of quite an aggressive security improvement plan because of a challenging audit that had been had. The following day, the Travelex kind of data breach happened, and then within sort of 2 weeks, we were sort of going into our first lockdown with COVID. So all those challenges to kind of deal with within the sort of first few weeks of arriving, was as you imagine, was quite challenging.
How did the Travelex breach affect Sainsbury's directly? Like, what's the connection?
Well, Sainsbury's Bank was from a kind of a foreign currency perspective, so people pay to get their kind of holiday money. Sainsbury's Bank was one of their, or if not their biggest customer. So for us and them, it was quite a big deal. And we can talk about it sort of reasonably openly because it's all in the kind of public domain now. But that was a significant breach, and obviously what we were concerned about was how much of our data do they have, and being mostly an autonomous unit within the Sainsbury's brand, you can imagine though that when the brand starts to get some challenges like that, the supermarket starts to take notice. And I would suggest managing them was rather more challenging than managing the breach.
Brilliant. And the British Transport Police, I'm aware that there's some things you can go into, some things you can't go into. So sort of top level for people, what are the sort of direction of travel that you're in at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, they're sort of kind of finding their way, really. I mean, a lot of companies have gone through an accelerated kind of digital transformation, and law enforcement organisations are no different. It was kind of sort of before my time, but the same as any kind of company, really. They suddenly were faced with everybody working from home, and how do they support that? And with a fairly creaking infrastructure, because bear in mind, policing is kind of part public sector. I think British Transport Police, in terms of their funding, they're not funded by the Home Office. They're funded by the kind of railway operating companies and Network Rail. So their sort of purse strings are even more kind of tightly drawn. So I think trying to support this was a real challenge for them, and they just didn't sort of have the money to kind of mobilise some of the things that were needed. So it was all done on a bit of a shoestring, if you like. And not only that, there is two sort of facets to that organisation. There's the command and control structure in relation to sort of policing, and then there's sort of what we call the non-policing staff. But all the money has got to be seen to be going into sort of the frontline policing activity, and so we get sort of what's ever left over after that, which is generally not a lot, and then security sort of outside of IT and support services kind of somewhat falls even lower down ranking. So getting that mandate, with an organisation like that can be difficult. Hi, Jenny.
Oh, I am so sorry, Adam. I think we were
ad-libbing.
Well, thanks to Russell for standing in there. I think the heat has gotten to my system. I hate technology. How are you, sir? So we've been talking, I assume, we've got to catch up. So can I ask for the tight audience to please forgive me? Apologies for that, and apologies to Adam. I think the heat got to my computer and it just would not work. I promise you it wasn't the meat space, Adam. So listen, I mean, I'm sure Russell's done a brilliant job and is now just having a brand here as he has a heart attack off screen. But welcome to the show. And you've been talking about your career and everything else. Where did we leave it? Where were we up to?
Well, we were just going sort of through the background of how I got into security, some of the different organisations I've worked for, and then we were just drawing some sort of comparisons between sort of the most recent previous gig, which was Sainsbury's Bank, and this one at British Transport Police. We're talking about sort of differences in terms of kind of security maturity and security posture in relation to sort of a Sainsbury's Bank being a kind of regulated entity through the FCA, and British Transport Police sort of it's not a regulatory accountability, but it's not to the same extent that something like a bank has. And just talking through some of those differences, really.
Well, we are. I mean, I am so pleased that you were able to come on and talk about all these things. And I wondered, after looking at your career, what you'd say to people who were sort of freshly minted CISOs, so people just coming in and maybe didn't have those years of experience you've had behind you. What advice you give to a freshly minted CISO? And then after that, I'm going to ask you what you give to some of our audience and people who've been CISOs for years themselves. I mean, It's been a tumultuous 18 months.
Yeah. No, so I mean, I would say firstly, I mean, do your own thing and find your own way. I mean, I didn't sort of just arrive as a CISO. I spent sort of quite some years sort of managing projects and programs, and I think one of the things that stood me in good stead with that was not to be afraid to give bad news. And I think sometimes as a CISO you can often be in that territory. And I think also, managing expectations is another kind of useful skill to have, really, just in terms of how you present things, and what's reasonable and what's not. And I guess that probably sort of leads us into some of the other things you want to talk about in terms of kind of,
I mean, it's very much on theme for today, and I think given that I missed at the beginning, completely missed the beginning bit. But I know that we did go through in the rehearsal where, of course, the tech worked absolutely perfectly. I know that we were talking about that and about linking this all in, because when you say managing expectations, our news article today, and I'll bring the rest of the panel in a minute, is going to be about burnout. And I know it's a topic that we've spoken about before. but you're managing expectations not just of the business but of your own team, and sometimes I would imagine of themselves, really.
Yeah, I think just in respect of burnout and CISO burnout, I think when we kind of go into these roles, some of these things kind of come with the territory, and I think as CISOs and senior leaders, we have to be sort of fairly robust. So, whilst we want to seemingly be across everything, I don't think, certainly in my career, I've not been afraid to sort of push back and say, there's only so much that we can absorb. And I think, as a CISO for myself, I have the experience and I'm brave enough to do that. But what I need to be mindful of is kind of what's also happening with my team as we kind of manage the work down to them. How's their welfare? How are they doing? Are they going to burn out? And, I think in that respect, it's important that we provide that kind of shielding and protection of resources, because we do know that obviously cyber teams work very hard, and potentially got lots of other skills that certainly in today's world get called on a lot. We're all working remotely quite a lot of the time. Some of that remote access infrastructure is a bit flimsy. I see my teams all the time sort of deviating, I suppose, from what they should be doing, and this again is something that we're going to talk about later. Just because they need to be there to kind of keep the lights on and do stuff, and they're trying to do their kind of day jobs as well. And I think it's just recognition of that. And I'll give you a story, actually. It's kind of quite recent. A person sort of works for me, sort of, pick up the phone and just say that they felt their mental health was being affected. And just sort of probing into that, the sort of, the reason that they gave for that was they were part of a project team. They were doing some kind of Scrum activity. They couldn't do the daily stand-ups anymore. They were being asked to kind of write it down. What did you do today? What do you plan to do tomorrow? What are your obstacles? That kind of thing. And that person just felt that was just a kind of, a reach too far for them. And I guess in isolation, I think, well, what's the big deal? But actually, if you look at everything else that they're doing, there's maybe one thing, the straw that breaks the camel's back.
Absolutely.
And I think, that was it. And I think as we as CISOs and senior leaders, we need to kind of recognize that, not only catch it, but try and spot it before it happens, so that we can take the pressure off the teams and actually sort of manage upwards again. So we can't just keep working longer, harder, faster. We have to kind of be seen to, give these teams a bit of a break.
Well, I think almost like we rehearse it. I think those are really good points. And I think we should, at that point, bring in the rest of our panel, because, we're certainly touching on that. So I'd like to invite up Andy Edwards, who's the CISO at Butterfield Group, and John Wimbo, who's the Director of Information Security at GSK. Welcome, gentlemen. And again, apologies for me just disappearing. I think the tech just got overheated, just did not like this platform all of a sudden. And I just want to say hello to our audience and to say that I can see just about, though it is glitchy at my end, folks, all of the chat. So it's great to see you all again after our summer break. Don't forget that the most engaged comments or wittiest questions, or perhaps reasons why my tech went crazy, and keep them polite, certain regulars in that audience. I think maybe the most novel reason why Jenny's tech didn't work, apart from the fact that it's about 1,000,000 degrees in this studio, might well win a teissTalk mug today. I want to say thank you there to Adam Castle for that fabulous interview. And I mean, Adam raises good points, John, doesn't he? I mean, it's all about that managing expectations, not just of yourself and upwards, but the team themselves, right?
Yeah, no, I think that was an excellent point. And I think, we may think we're different in cyber, and to an extent, if we're dealing with crisis, then yes, we're constantly going to be under stress. But there's a lot of other roles out there that are operational, have similar stresses. I mean, COVID layered on a couple of additional stresses. I think for a lot of us, we ended up having to do a lot of work for our employees, but also our third parties to work from home and secure all of that. We in the pharma industry suddenly became a much bigger target than we were before. So that was an additional stressor. But people generally like to be heroes. And part of this is to manage the team so that you can actually say to them, look, you can actually go home because there's somebody in a different time zone that can take over from you. So keeping a close eye on it, like Adam said, is really, really important.
And I mean, your role at GSK, and I mean, I'll come to Andy and ask the same question in a minute, but, we're going to get on to the whole idea of today's topic, which is, what should a CISO and the security function not own? your role there. We were talking yesterday in the preparation about like the different types of roles that there are, and you said, you know, one of these, the things that you do is you sort of straddle a couple of camps, don't you, really, at GSK?
Yeah, so I looked after operations and looking after the incident response and crisis and all of that stuff for about sort of 15 years, and then more recently straddled into being more of an interface into the business. And actually I thought, interfacing to the business is going to be a lot easier because that would be a 9 to 5. It's more of a consultative role. How wrong was I? Suddenly we started getting 2 or 3 third-party breaches every week that contained our data. And suddenly we were literally shoulder to shoulder with the business, trying to understand what the impact of those was. So actually, both roles hugely stressful, and exactly like Adam said, you know, you have to be really careful you don't get burnt out, and your team doesn't get burnt out.
Yeah, I mean, Andy, welcome to the show, Andy Edwards. I'm sorry again that I missed you at the beginning, but you know, I mean, you've had a career in lots of big sort of companies, and I mean, has your role evolved? Would you agree with what John and Adam says about that kind of managing the business upwards, sideways, you know, every which way really these days?
Yeah, I suppose, like, so from early on in my career, it's more of the technical focus on it, and then you don't really fully understand what you're doing, how it's impacting the business, whether it's a new solution, whether it's how you even report an incident or how you move forward with things. Because, you know, fundamentally, you don't really, it's not you don't care about the business structure, but you don't fully understand it because you don't need to, because it's not part of your job when you're younger in that more technical space. As where when you get to more the CISO position, you're already filtered the way you present. You know, is it that bad? Is there, you know, you more provide the solution rather than the actual problem itself, and you try and upgrade the solution to being bigger than the problem, right? And so, you know, similar to John, like when I came to where I was fortunate enough to build all the security operations because we didn't really have anything, and then take the CISO role on and move forward. So to prevent burnout, I was given the option to build a big team with a SOC or build automation. So we built automation and we brought more people in that were more specialist. So our guys would only rather focus on more incident-based stuff. So they weren't worried about raising tickets for phishing emails. They weren't, you know, they were more focused on when a real incident's on, they're just dealing with that, not the backlog of tickets they have to get through, or somebody from the business asking them if they can change a rule on a firewall or if this website could be unblocked and things like that. So we kind of moved to that more next generation to try and remove burnout from the team. So, and you know, burnout happens in 2 ways, right? It's not just you're busy working all the time. You can be busy doing nothing all the time. You get boredom kicks in, you get burnout, and then, you know, that can happen from that way as well. And we've seen that. I seen that at Siemens a long time ago, especially in the security team. Staff would be, because there'd be too many staff, and there'd be only big incidents. So the small incidents, they just wouldn't pay attention to.
It's such a roller coaster, isn't it? You know, exactly. IR is such a roller coaster. I mean, we saw it today. We had a live demonstration there of how well that we handle instant response. But I mean, I just want to pick up on one thing that you said there, Andy, and take it over to Adam, because Andy's mentioned there the automation of some of the function. And I know that you raised this when we were doing some preparation for this yesterday, that, you know, is that seen as giving it away? What's the role in sort of automation over the security function, what we actually have to do and have to own? I mean, surely that's a way of making things quicker and more efficient most of the time, Adam.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, with the advent of automation, I mean, we can achieve so much more. I mean, certainly in the security space, you know, if we didn't have it, you know, things like sort of trawling through events and, you know, kind of alerts and that, because I mean, we did just kind of generate sort of hundreds of thousands, millions of kind of alerts and kind of different bits of data to kind of look at. And, you know, what we need the automation for is to try and help us sort of sift through that, prioritize it, and set our attentions on you know, what we should be looking at. You know, whether there's going to become, you know, a time of the rise of the machines, if you like, and we're going to see sort of, you know, less involved in it. I think we're some way off that. But I mean, you know, cyber security talks a lot about, you know, machine learning, artificial intelligence, you know, quantum mechanics, quantum computing, that kind of thing. I think, you know, that's great. We're all on a journey towards that. But I think, we're some way off from being sort of, fully automated and letting those kinds of things take over. But yeah, absolutely. In terms of where we were sort of 10, 15 years ago, things like security orchestration, automation response, and that kind of thing, we're able to kind of do a lot more now. And the fact that just those data sizes are just huge. Without that element of automation, we just wouldn't be able to get over it.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing is, I think the function's grown so much that there are some things that we've just got to go down that line with. I mean, John, did you do a lot, at GSK in terms of that? Is transformation and digital transformation something that's owned by your department, that's led by them? I mean, to what extent has that type of thing kind of influenced what your team do?
Yeah, so I mean, digital transformation's not owned by our department. It's sort of a global thing across our sort of tech organization. Tech's what we call IT. And I think it's important that so we talk about automation and orchestration, we talk about digital and that whole journey, and that is important. But when I looked after the operations team, I would try to look at it as, we have a lot of knowledge workers. We have people in our team that are hugely capable, really clever at what they do. And when I analysed what they did, most of the time they were dealing with quite low level incidents and things that actually they don't need to be dealing with. Like, for example, what happened with you earlier. Hey, my laptop's just failed, or the server that stores the logs from a particular system has just failed. I need to go and fix that.
Yeah.
And we made a change to effectively say, right, all of that stuff doesn't need to be done by security. It can be done by tech. They can look after the tech. They can make sure that it's running. We can have our people concentrated on doing the knowledge working, and then automating underneath that the alerts and what have you. So I guess before digital came along, or this term digital came along, 10 years ago, we were looking at that and saying, actually, we need our best people. We've employed them to do this role. 90% of the time, they're not doing it. Let's get them back to that role, and let's take the rest of it and put it somewhere else.
Yeah. I mean, I think though, what sort of springs to my mind hearing the three of you speak about this is the fact that, if you work for large organizations, you do have that luxury of being able to say, well, there's some things we'll spend money here and we'll automate there, but perhaps in a smaller organization, it's not as straightforward to even be able to do it, even if you'd like to. I mean, Andy, would you say that people are going to struggle if there's, not if there's less resources, but if there's just, fewer people to go around in terms of planning that move to automation and saying what the security function wants to push out?
It's the complete opposite. So considering I worked at Siemens, which was probably about 900,000 staff, to where I work now, which is 1,300 staff. Right? Yeah. So there's a few other companies in between, but this is probably the smallest place. But to drive change here, it's a lot easier. It's a lot quicker. Because you can, without coining the term, you are more agile with things. You can get to the business quicker. You don't have to go through so many layers of business and so many layers of governance. Bigger the company, they tend to put more governance in place because it gives people jobs that doesn't really need to be there. And importantly, governance is the most important part of what we do in security, right? Without governance, we're just as bad as some tech folk, I say. So, but no, in a smaller organization, it's a lot easier and it's a lot better, because then you can get the message a lot quicker across. But I find larger organizations much harder to get it done.
Yeah. Well, time is a factor, Adam. I mean that's the thing about. I mean, I think Andy's point about agile is so good, because it swings and roundabouts. On the one hand, you might have better resources and more people, but I mean, trying to get things through some of the large companies and some of the places you've worked, I mean, the larger the organisation, Andy's point's right, isn't it? The slower it is, the more objections you're going to get.
I think there's that. I think also in smaller companies as well, if they're not necessarily structured according to kind of standard business or organisational structures that kind of we understand. And we were talking a little bit about this before you joined, Jenny, just in relation to British Transport Police. There is a sort of command and control side of the organisation, which is policing, and then is what's called sort of non-police staff, which is kind of support staff. That's where procurement is, IT, security, all those other kind of functions. But to truly get, you know, the mandate for security, you need to get into that command and control organization. And you know, me personally, okay, I'm quite new to that organization, but it's very difficult to get a look in. It's not just me, you know, the CIO can't get a look in. And I think and until you get to those people that absolutely drive, you know, security and other kind of change types of things that we want to do from the top down, us trying to do it from sort of, you know, halfway is always going to be a struggle. And that organization is probably 4,000 people. So it's not a huge, you know, there's not a huge amount of people there, but actually, you know, because of how it's structured, just because it's smaller doesn't necessarily mean that it's, you know, it's easier to get stuff done.
No. Well, look, let's have a look at some of the questions that are coming in for you guys, because there's some really good ones. And I think the first one is going to go back to Adam, but then I'm interested in the answers that John and Andy may have as well. And it's from one of our regular audience members, Lee, who says, at Sainsbury's, did you have any issues that you can talk about, Adam, obviously, with legacy systems? Lee says, during my last role, I had to look at integration with delivery pipeline and noted there were legacy systems that looked important to the supply chain. So I suppose we're talking about sometimes you've got that system in place. You can't just offset it, right? I mean, Adam, you did ask specifically about Sainsbury's first. Answer what you can. I realise we can't always.
Sorry, I didn't see the question, but I mean, you know, I think that's the challenge for all organisations. How do you kind of deal with your heritage IT, especially when it goes out of support and it's no longer being patched? You know, it's a significant attack vector, right? I mean, you know, I've worked for several organisations where, you know, we have kind of risks like that kind of written up, including Sainsbury's, and also I think more one that kind of rings sort of, you know, more bells in that respect, you know, stay within the Sainsbury's brand was with Argos, who had lots and lots of kind of yeah, I guess out of date systems, because, you know, they used a lot of kind of OT as well, and their kind of sort of plant warehousing facilities and kind of things like that. And I think, you know, the challenges for organisations is kind of where to spend the money, you know, as part of digital transformation or kind of other projects and change portfolios. Then, you know, are those systems sort of get picked up and I guess brought up to date? And that's going to sort of depend on whether there's a business case for how much money we've got to spend on it, how much it's going to cost to replace, and all those kind of things that sort of factored into the decision making versus, well, you know, how much of a risk is it to keep it going as it is? And that's what we take forward with the business folks and say, okay, you know, here's the decision you need to make, and here's the intelligence to make the decision off the back of. Absolutely.
I mean, I can imagine, John, that, you know, in an organisation that says GSK, you've got that heritage IT from part of your own business, never mind, the supply chain must be gigantic. So, I mean, is that legacy part of something that you know, as a function, you'd want to try and offset some of that? I mean, again, we can't always just push it out, I guess.
No, so and that comes back to that balance, as Adam was saying, that balance of risk and what do you do with it? You know, how much does it cost you to remove that and what's the benefit? The one thing though with us, of course, we've got, you know, huge numbers of, you know, production sites all around the world. You know, let's just talk about the ones that we own. Yeah. And there's a huge amount of technology in there that is bang up to date that does all of that stuff, but yet is still running Windows 7. And is still running unpatched sort of embedded operating systems, but that's how the vendor supplies it. You know, we're trying to put pressure on vendors as an industry to say, hey, this is, you know, you need to change the way it works. But ultimately, that is not just a threat to that particular production line. That is a threat to the company, because if that gets breached, then potentially the corporate network gets breached. So we have a huge program. You know, literally to look at the sites, look at the value of the sites, and look at what's being protected, to bring in controls dependent on the risk to protect at that layer. And it's a huge undertaking. I mean, that's a program that had to go right to the board to get approval, because that's not something you do overnight, and it's not something you can do easily in a big company. It costs a lot of money.
Yeah, I mean, we've got things. We've got Andy, one of our regulars, Scott, saying, Argos, the Book of Dreams, the magic Book of Dreams. And also, you know, some nice comments in the chat from people saying, you know, it depends on things like reporting structures, organizational size, as well as politics and local politics, which is a I thought was an interesting comment. But we've got a question directly for Andy. And again, it's from Lee about this kind of outsourcing and third party and legacy and everything. And Lee asks you, Andy, particularly, did the outsourcing model for Siemens, for example, cause significant delays in implementing change? I guess in the similar way to that John's just been talking about with that massive company structure.
Yeah, so when Siemens sold a part of the business to Atos, so obviously some of the Siemens staff got 2 feet across, so they become, all IT was purely outsourced. So you pretty much paid like per desk, and everything was based on per seat. So this, how much security would cost, how much service delivery, software, and so forth. Yeah, of course. I mean, it changed. I mean, because you don't have full control anymore. So you're dealing with a third-party organization that you're not its main responsibility. The contract maybe, but from a higher-up decision-making process, they're dealing with 12, 13, 14 other large companies alone.
Yeah.
So just be the way you want it. You have to. They will standardize their delivery because they can't afford to have 60 custom ways of delivering it for their customers. Though Siemens as itself is a combination of hundreds of companies put together, right?
Yes.
Makes it one of the largest companies in the world. But luckily Siemens, being a big German company, they're big on standardization, which kind of fitted a lot of the Atos model. But yeah, I mean, whenever you outsource companies of that size, yeah, service delivery does take an impact, but it is something that you plan for,
I mean, I wonder then, like, just to get to our topic with the three of you, what is it that we think we should be bringing in that perhaps traditionally isn't seen as something that we do and that CISOs do? Because one of the things that seems to come up to me over and over again on this show is vendor management, supply chain management, procurement, budgets, all of which, by the way, Tice does have. You might want to tell your procurement colleagues, Tice does have a new talk show all about supply chain procurement, which I didn't plan to say, but like a goddamn pro, recovering from the incident and now saying it. But I mean, do you think something like that needs to come into the function? And it's there already, isn't it? You're already having to manage these vendors. No, certain aspects of it.
No, I don't think so. I mean, so from a side perspective, you give your input from a risk perspective on vendor management. So you feed into a vendor management program, making sure that the vendors you're onboarding have a part of your risk within your risk appetite. So, make sure they are secure, they are going to process your data in the right way, they are going to store it in the right way. And when you have that program in place and then you feed into vendor management, that's fine. That ticks the cyber boxes of vendor management. But vendor management is a function and it's a machine all in itself.
Yeah, but what I'm saying, Andy, is, and I'm just, and I'll pass it to you, it really is, and I think it should stay there. But I know that just internal struggles, let's imagine that the security function says we're going to bring this supplier on board. We want this shiny new box that all the vendors have sold us that's so wonderful, and then we're just going to plug it in and we'll never have another incident. And you know that we agree, other functions agree contracts and things before it gets to vendor management. That was my point. I think you're right. I agree with you, but I do think that this is one of these things that the function's starting to have to look after and starting to be more mindful of, particularly with these third-party breaches, John.
You've blown my mind with that one. You really have. I mean, in terms of vendor management, obviously vendor management, you'd have to have legal expertise in your team. You'd have to have privacy experts in your team. I mean, that's another conversation where the privacy sits within security, of course. But one thing that I think is important, and I just wanted to point out, Scott put something in the chat and he said it's all fine on paper saying that IT does identity, but security can't realistically give it away. Now, obviously that's about identity, but that's a really good phrase for a lot of things that we do. But my philosophy is security doesn't have to do it, but security, and Andy used this word, security should govern it. So in terms of identity and running federation services and single sign-on and stuff like that, I mean, my goodness, if that goes down, the company goes down, you really don't want security running that. You need the people that really understand how to bring that back and how to run it and how to make it resilient. But ultimately, we need to govern how that's configured, how it runs, make sure we get the logs out of it and monitor it. So we are accountable for it because, Scott said, we'll lead an incident or a crisis if it comes to it. So some of those things, it's not quite as easy as saying is something in the security organization or not. It might be that just the governance sits within security and the function sits outside. That whole procurement one, I'm not on the same page as you with that one.
Well, what I'm saying is, though, and no, I mean, I think we're sort of rigorously agreeing with each other. Is I don't think it should be the case as well. But come back to Adam and to something you said yesterday. The problem is we don't just sit in functions. Security people do have to communicate with vendors sometimes, and sometimes I suppose I'm labeling it wrong and calling it vendor management or procurement. But that, we deal very closely with our third-party suppliers. And Adam, yesterday you mentioned the role. You said, well, there's CISO, and now there's this role, BISO, that we're here. And I mean, it's an expression I've only heard very recently. And that's partly sort of embracing all, it's a more holistic approach, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it was also just echoing the fact that I guess, people come into security from different routes, as we said at the start. You have some very kind of, technically focused, so probably sort of like Andy, who may sort of come through a kind of, a SOC security operation type environment, know the kind of deep techie stuff. And on the other hand, you've got people a bit more like me who sort of left technology behind a long time ago, but, sort of worked in business quite a lot, did a lot of studying, that kind of thing. And sort of quite happy sort of carrying those boardroom kind of conversations as long as kind of technical support around me. And my skill, I suppose, in that is trying to kind of translate that technical speak to the business community so they can make kind of risk-based decisions off the back of it. I think it's also interesting, sort of, Andy and John nodding away in terms of kind of, vendor management and not getting involved in stuff. I wish that were the case. And it might be the case in lots of big, well-structured organisations. But I mean, certainly where I've been, if I had £1 for every time I got involved in some kind of vendor management issue, I wouldn't have to work anymore. I mean, every role that I've done, I would say, in the last 5 or 6 years has brought me into contact with either vendor management, sort of, just being part of a kind of stakeholder group, kind of, marking scorecards and that kind of thing, to spending kind of 6 months with a legal person and their opposite number in the organisation that we were trying to sign up to a global security operations centre. And it was Dollars Dishwater, but I mean, nobody else was going to do it. So, we had to just kind of...
Great quote for the procurement podcast that's coming up there. It was Dollars Dishwater, but somebody had to do it. I'm sure they think that we're all geeky and boring as well. It does. But my point is that we're cross-functional now, really. And I think one of the things, again, Lee said in the chat, obviously this is a topic close to Lee's heart, is he said a lot of the contracts are signed prior to cyber really being on the radar. So, sometimes it's the roles within, who goes to a vendor when there's been an issue, who goes there, I think as Adam's just said, when there's blame, when there's instant response, when there's, there's been an incident, there's been a breach, Andy, that's coming through, through a third party, or as John's put examples in there and said, there's a lot of this system's running on Windows 7. What do we do? How do we protect it?
Yeah, so it's quite funny because we only uncovered a contract that was signed 100 years ago, and ever since the company's evolved, and they were still operating under those terms.
Oh my god!
And they were breached. It wasn't they didn't hold any of our data or anything like that, but we worked closely with them. They pretty much just printed checkbooks is all they did. But back then they were just printing it like hand presses, but the same contract was still valid, so they were breached. So. Yeah, I mean, it's the CISO's role to go and figure out what's going on. Are we at risk? What's our risk exposure to this? And report back to the business, and that that's exactly what we did, and even to the point where we could go in and help them. But the more and more you do, like a lot of the programs we put in place to assess risk, they're quite new. And all these contracts were signed years ago, way before cyber existed within the bank that I'm in now. So. We, as the contracts are for renewal, we're re-implementing this, going through it, and you have suppliers going, "Oh, but it wasn't this hard before. It was we could just do what we wanted." But so that does.
I tell you now, from a procurement point of view, procurement will tell you that if the supplier is friendly with the tech team, so with me it was engineers more than IT, more than cyber, then. It's the bane of procurement's life, because procurement will say, well, everything's agreed before I can't negotiate because IT have just told me that this is what they have to have. They've told the vendor they have to have it for a heritage IT or a legacy software or whatever. So you can't negotiate anything at that point because the technical expertise isn't with the procurement. It's with you. It's with you. It's with IT. And I think that's where communication internally is clearly something that we get back to almost on every single show for teissTalk, and we're certainly looks to me like we're back there again and getting those roles clearly defined in an ever-changing landscape. So I'm going to come to you, the three of you gentlemen, for some final thoughts on this. But just before I do, just let me have just one more little look through these notes, because I think I've only had one reason why my tech went down at the beginning. And it's saying that it was from Coke and Rice, which is from Lee, because one time I spoke to Lee just after someone had spilled Coca-Cola on my laptop. Well, it wasn't that. It was the heat. I'm going to blame it. And if all of you blame user error, I will die in shame and retire right now. So it wasn't any of that. So yeah, we've got some great comments. What would people give away? We've got Scott saying identity 100% every time. We'll give that away. Identity management, I guess. And also 6 months of meetings with lawyers can go straight into 101. Room 101 for CISOs. So I think there's plenty that we would give away. Final thoughts on the topic. Adam, can we come to you first? What are your final thoughts on all of this?
Well, I just wanted to kind of finish with a bit of a story, actually. Just, I guess, sort of relates to kind of the last topic that we've been talking about. I mean, it was only very recently, someone sort of came up to me and said, your team's blocked us kind of implementing this, whatever it was, piece of technology, software product. And the first thing I said, well, does it meet our security requirements? And it was, the answer was, well, what are they? And I said, well, that's probably what what the problem is that, it's only now at the point when you're ready to push the button that, and it's only by accident that we've got wind of something, that, we're starting to have this discussion. And I think this again comes, back to sort of maturity of process, how organizations approach their kind of change portfolio and that kind of stuff. That, security are absolutely kind of stakeholders in that and should be engaged at the beginning. And the reason why we do that, we have that, is so we can prevent these sorts of issues, when it's ready to sort of go live. And that's the first time we get sort of sight of it. And I think, if we get engaged in those kind of early processes, it might be part of procurement because we're helping sort of draw down what the requirements are, and part of that requirement, after all, is the security requirement, and then we can make sure it's fit for purpose and it meets our needs.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think it's what it's got to be going forward. We just can't operate in the silos anymore. Clearly, we can't. Over to you, John. I mean, what's your closing thoughts on this?
That's a perfect advert for the BISO. Perfect advert. I think, and I don't know if it's Andy that said it. When you sort of start off in your career, and I did the same thing, I was technical, you're almost like in a silo. You could be working for any company. It doesn't really matter what business they're in. Everyone needs antivirus, everyone needs other security controls. And I think it's really important, that BISO role. And I've seen it in the last 3 years doing this role where, Adam, they don't know. They don't think, in our R&D organization, they're just focused on data and analytics and getting insights into data that allow us to develop medicine. They don't think about security. They just want connections wherever. They want data, whatever. They want to ingest it wherever. They just don't think about security. And you can't just go to them and say, by the way, here's the rule book. It's a conversation that you have with them to sort of bring them on that journey and explain what the impact is potentially if they do it in the wrong way, and how we can work with them to bring them on the journey. And then once that gets embedded in their brain, they say, oh, hang on a second, we do need to bring in the security guys. And that's where the BISO role can come in. It's not the only way of doing it, but since I've been doing the role, I'm a fan, and I think that really has helped us to bridge the gap between security and the business.
Yeah, and I mean, to do that well is gonna pave the way going forward for making it a lot easier for yourself.
John, sorry. And I was going to say that end you with that challenge, because having worked for an organisation also had a significantly sized R&D capability where everybody in that organisation was a PhD or higher. I actually found that you can't really teach those guys anything. That's true. But they don't think you can teach them anything, and that's where we used to get the most amount of data breaches. So I think it's absolutely imperative that you try and, like you say, create that sort of relationship and do that sort of education piece, because otherwise nothing's going to change. And at my time with that organisation, that was certainly where things like sort of data leakage or breach, that kind of thing. That's kind of where it all happened, and also that's kind of where the crown jewels were. So
absolutely,
yeah, exactly.
Andy, it falls to you, sir, to close this discussion.
So the BISO role, I'm not quite sure there's I'm not sure there's a need for a BISO role. I think part of being a CISO is your interface to the business. I think a key part is having a good interface to operational risk within your business, right? Mm-hmm. Because that's for me where this BISO thing comes from, is the operational risk guys would be running that. And if you've got that interface to them, that's what you do. You see, interface directly with the business, you interface directly with operational risk, because security event is part of the operational risk, and depending where it goes, it expands outwards. So it's getting that support there is really important. So
you're laughing because the latest buzzword has come across. Like,
I mean, if I have yet to meet a BISO, but
no, John, didn't you say that?
And by the way, we don't just have one business; we have 4. In fact, we probably have 7 if you break them down, and they're all like different companies. And if you don't have that sort of role in that organisation, you really can't influence anything.
But when you have what we did, well, and this was ages ago in Siemens, we had the CISO office, right? And then you'd have the CISO for UK, you'd have CISO for Northwest Europe, you'd have the CISO for, and then you'd have business aligned ones, so rail and transport, air, defense, air, navy, military, and so forth. And you had the different functions there, and basically everybody would come together once a year for a conference, but then you'd all have alignments across and work through different ones like that, because you're sharing it at that role. But fundamentally, you all agree to one set of policies and standardizations. Now, each business is always going to be fundamentally different and needs its own customizations, because you can't run a rail business the way you run a wind farm business, right? It's just, they don't work, and the security works differently and so forth. But your core principles and your governance you surround it with, I think, if you run it as a CISO office and not as just like one guy making all the shots and doing all the calls, I think it works better.
Yeah, and that's how we have it. It's not just me.
Well, listen, it's been brilliant to have teissTalk back up and running after the summer, despite our little test of the technology there. I want to say thank you to all 3 of my guests today, to Adam Castle, to John Wimbow, and to Andy Edwards. And thank you to our audience who have come up with picnic errors, idiot errors, various reasons for my tech going down. And I think actually today, Scott Wilson has put some absolutely brilliant, sorry, I said second name, should not, done some absolutely brilliant questions. So I think we should give a teissTalk mug to Scott. But I also think today our teissTalk elves deserve a mug for soldiering on so brilliantly when my tech failed. Don't you just hate the user interface? Join Jeff White on Thursday for his show, and teissTalk every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. for more conversation, chatter, and hopefully no technical faults. Thanks to the audience, and thanks to the elves, and thanks to my guests. Join me next time. Goodbye.
Thanks, guys.